Hi class, we're going to cover chapter 13 on your textbook, policies that contain cost. This will be the last chapter we cover from the book. In the previous chapter we talked about enhancing access, so now we're going to talk about the cost, and those two are the pillars of the policy making when it comes to healthcare, right? By now you've noticed that we seem to be touching on certain topics more than once, and that kind of makes sense because we are going full circle. We're going all around. We're looking at everything from every possible angle, and that necessarily forces us to look at certain things more than once. Again, sometimes from different angles. We're going to talk a lot about Massachusetts. Well, we're going to talk a significant amount about Massachusetts because it kind of all started here, and God, maybe it'll end here as well. We'll see. And what do I mean that it all started here? Well, it all started here because Massachusetts was the first state to introduce something that was significant, and that it was significant in size, and it was directly aimed at changing and controlling cost and access, and that was the Massachusetts healthcare reform in the mid-2000s, implemented in 2007. And actually, this is personal because this is what drove me. I was going to say forced me. I think nobody forced me, but it drove me into the healthcare industry. That's when I started working for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts in 2007, and I was working in healthcare reform. So I was living and breathing Massachusetts healthcare reform every single day for 2 years. Even before it went live, I was part of the implementation team. So I remember those days of reading pages and pages and pages of the proposed legislation and how it changed, and then we'll do things, then it will change, and we'll react to that. So it was very interesting. Little I knew that the Massachusetts healthcare reform was the basis for the Affordable Care Act that later came during the President Obama's administration. The objective of the Massachusetts healthcare reform was, as usual, reduce cost, increase access to care. So, what did it do? Well, it did improve access to care. That access to care is usually it's fairly easy to improve in general. Uninsured went from 10% down to 4%. I remember that 4% has. I mean, I don't deal with this anymore, but for 4 or 5 years after 2007, this was an ongoing battle trying to figure out how many were actually uninsured. I saw the numbers go anywhere from 1 to 4%. I think I was very happy using a 2.7%, if I recall. That was the number that I used for all my presentations. And I forgot right now how I came up with that number. It was a mix of my own estimates and some other estimates, but they were based on data. I had pretty good data from the census and other sources to come up with that number. The premiums at the time were the highest in the country, well known. So did this work? Yeah, a little bit, not really, kind of. No, we're still among the highest. Fine. If before we were the highest, now we're among the highest. Didn't really change much. It did for a few years after the healthcare reform after 2007. We did see some of the costs go down. We saw rates go down, premiums not go down, but not grow as fast. But eventually that all changed again. So I would say that not as successful as some thought it was going to be. The medical spend is still growing 6 to 8%. So nothing, very little. some of the issues are when it comes to access to care, is that newly covered residents, and we're talking about some of those uninsured, some additional ones, they just cannot find a doctor. So it is great that you have this idea that technically improves access to care, but if there are no providers willing to take you in, willing or able to take you in, well, you still don't have access to care. Fine, you do have a card in your hand that shows that you have the you are covered by insurance, but you still cannot get that care. So what happens then? What happens when an individual is given a card, some kind of ID that says, "Hey, someone else is going to pay for my care. Give it to me." Well, if you cannot get the care, what do? You go to the emergency room. So that's something that we noticed, that emergency room care claims increase significantly. So I have here 10%, and I remember that number, and it depends on, I could play with that number a little bit, but it was in some cases higher than 10, other cases maybe right at 10, but it was significant, and we knew that. I don't want to bore you with a lot of things, but there was we shift a lot of resources into looking how we could control ER cost. We did a lot of work, new products, new initiatives to control ER, because we knew that was a weak point. That we knew all the care was going there. I can also tell you at a personal level that I was in the streets of Boston and talking to people, and when I talk to people, I'm talking about to real people. I'm talking about some of them were uninsured a few years earlier, and now at that point they got insurance. Talking to them, I realized how big the problem was. Most individuals, especially those that just became covered, still think that the emergency room is the first place where you get care and not your PCP. That's still the case. Very eye-opening for me. It was very interesting. I did that 3 years in a row, spending a whole day talking to people in the street. What else? So the problem is that this is very common in policy, in legislation. They treated the symptoms, not the problem. That is very typical of policymakers. It's actually typical of also in private business. That's some of you have heard me talk in other courses about this, where people they fall in love with their solutions. They come up with solutions, they fall in love, they implement the solutions, just to realize that their solutions have nothing to do with the actual problem. Nothing to do with it. It's like if you have a fever, if I put you in a bucket of ice, well, that will treat the fever. Probably, yeah. If you freeze me to death, if you freeze me like a I don't know, like a squid, yeah, I guess so. But you're not treating the cause of the fever, which is probably an infection. So it will come up again, right? Unless you kill me from freezing me. So the government is like, oh my God, what is going on? Cost is still going up. What do we do? Like, oh, we know what's going on. There is all of this high utilization of high-tech treatments, especially high-tech radiology like MRI, CTs, and so on. What do? Let's limit the growth and access to those treatments. So we actually did this. We actually came up with a new legislation that limited the amount of effort and money providers were allowed to put into certain practices. Basically, the government figured that if we limit the growth of these practices, we will control costs, right? Because maybe I'm not being clear. If you limit the number of MRIs and CTs, the number of machines, the number of places where you can get one, then people won't be able to get them. Therefore, you control cost. That's right. I mean, technically, that should work. Yeah, kind of. But eventually, again, keep thinking of like a pipe that has a tiny hole and you put a Band-Aid. Eventually, it will burst, right? What else did they do? Then in 2009, and this one I remember so well because we freaked out. We just freaked out when this happened. The government rejected our rates, our proposed rates. In I think it was 2009, 2010. I don't remember the dates anymore that well, but we had to increase our rates because cost was going up, and the government just rejected our rates for merge market and so on. So we were looking down the abyss because we cannot sell insurance, which we actually do, by the way, but that's a different story. We cannot sell insurance for less than the amount that we get billed, the amount of money that we pay in bills, because we will go bankrupt. And it just reminds me that I haven't told you that story. I will. I should probably. So that was bad. So now insurance companies were like, wow, we cannot make the rates that we need to make. What are we going to do? So people react. People find ways. So we had to get innovative to find ways to increase the revenue. And I'm talking about insurance firms. But so did the providers. The providers did the same thing. They were looking for ways to get around all of these things and provide more care and get paid more. We'll talk about that later as well. What else? The same problem. The problem here is that policymakers go back to the first. I'm going back to the first bullet point here is that policymakers are great at treating symptoms and not the problems. The Massachusetts healthcare reform, just like ACA, treats the symptom and not the problem. One of the real problems, if the real problem here, is lack of competition and transparency. I should add on this slide. Nothing in the Massachusetts MHR nor in the ACA address this. Nothing. The problem is lack of competition and price transparency. Those two need to be fixed. If you fix those two, you would control cost. Okay, so at a very basic, that formula looks like Einstein's relativity formula. That formula looks kind of scary, but not really. It makes perfect sense, right? When policymakers are looking at cost, total expenditures in medical care, it's just going to be equal to the sum, sigma, the sum of the fees, the prices, multiplied by the quantity, right? So if you have one MRI, and each MRI is $500, right? So it's 500 times 1. And the sum, well, in this case, we only have 1. If we had 2, right, it would be 2 times 1,000, whatever I said. I said 500, 2 times 500, 1,000, and so on. So the sum of the price times the quantity for all the procedures in the healthcare industry, that gives you total expenditures. Okay, so now that you know the formula, right, you can attack the problem. You can take this apart and figure out what the problem. So the problem is total expenditures is high, and total expenditures depends on price and quantity. Okay, so what can you do? You can do something about P, you can do something about Q. Okay, you can mandate fee schedules. You can change the way you pay. You can do things to payment to control P. If P goes down, total expenditures goes down as well. Okay, so that's one way. Another way of doing it is what we call resource rationing. And the word rationing will be a word that you, related to healthcare, it's a word that you will only see in a class like this, because policymakers will never use the word rationing. Well, unless they are criticizing the model, unless they're on the opposite side. So rationing, right, is limiting access to care. So that's Q. If you bring down Q, you will bring down TE, total expenditure, right? The less quantity, which, by the way, I just mentioned, that's what Massachusetts did back in the day by limiting the amount of money going into improvements and expansion of certain care. They just didn't want too much care to be given out. And that was one way of controlling the Q. But they never call it rationing, okay? Because this is last resort. We're going to talk about that. You want to talk about this, you can talk about this, fair, no problems. You will not be criticized by the media. You will not be criticized by your people. Nothing. Talk about Q, you'll be in trouble immediately. Okay, so Q is last resort. We'll see about that. And then is global budgeting. Global budgeting is controlling the P and the Q at the same time, right? Like, look, I can control how much I'm going to pay you for an MRI. I may not want to control how many MRIs you deliver into the market, but I can tell you that I'm only going to give you $10,000 for all your MRIs. So you figure that out. Clearly, right, if you look at the other side, which is going to be the provider, when the provider hears global budgeting, the provider hears resource rationing. Isn't that right? And for the same token, if you think about it, when the provider hears price, fee schedules, they also hear rationing. Because if the government is going to reduce how much they pay for a specific procedure, the provider is going to react by reducing the amount they provide of that procedure. Okay, so the Q is here. Nobody wants to talk about it, but there are ways to get to it without talking about it. And that's what's interesting about it. That's what is interesting about Q. Some countries have openly gone after Q. UK, Germany, Japan, they all done it. They're pretty open about the Q. Okay, the Q word. That should be my show. If I ever write a show, it would be the Q word. So let's start with mandated fee schedule. We're going to talk about all three. So let's talk about mandated fee schedules. Every government-run system has some type of price setting, of price control, price ceilings, price caps, price schedules, you name it. But they all try to control pricing somehow. We've seen that in multiple chapters. The providers can still maintain profits under these price controls if they can control their own cost. If they do that, they can keep their margins, keep their profits, and you know what that means: layoffs, rationing of care, right? Reducing care, and there's there are far more interesting things like bundling and et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways they can get around that, for sure, because providers are humans, and humans always try to find a way out of everything, as they should. That's called innovation. Well, that's what I call innovation. So fee schedules, they may work for some time, they may work at times for some time. They don't work in the long run. In the long run, people react and they find ways around it. You are going to, by creating a price ceiling, by introducing a price ceiling, something else is going to change down the line. We talked about price ceilings before, but I'm going to do it one more time because it is related. So if this is just a normal market with a supply and demand, right? So we have a PO. I'm sorry, my PO is a little too high. That should be right here. So in equilibrium, we will have price PO and QO quantity. There will be equilibrium at point A. If the government establishes a price ceiling at P1, where we cannot go past that point, let's assume for a second, and only for a second, because This is a very silly assumption, but we're doing it just to prove a point. Let's assume that the suppliers, the providers in this case, are willing to go along with it, and they're not going to change their behavior. They're actually going to go along with it and provide whatever people want at whatever price they want to, regardless of their cost structure, they don't care, they'll do it, right? Okay, let's say that they do that, fine. Then prices will go down to P1 because that's by law, fine. And quantity will go down to Q1. Something happened here, all my little labels shifted a little bit. Q1 should be right here. Okay, great. So the problem here is that has to do with the slope of the demand curves. This is a very inelastic market. Healthcare is very inelastic. So what happens is when you change price, quantity does not adjust by as much as you were thinking it would adjust. So you put in place this price ceiling, but quantity did not change that much. And you can actually do the exercise of the values and this is why I use this engineering graph here. You can use the little squares. Yeah, I'm talking about these little blue squares, right? The paper in the background. You can use it to calculate the value. So before in equilibrium, if you count the squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? I have the maths here. It's a 6/8. So consumer surplus, what we call consumer surplus, is like the benefit to consumers. It's 48. Is the square created by 0, nothing, up to PO, up to the right to A, and then down to QO. That big square, it's 48 squares. Once the price ceiling is put in place, then the area will be from 0 to P1, across to B, down to Q1, and that is 33. If I'm correct, excuse me, yeah, 1, 2, 3. Exactly. Good. So what has happened here is that the total benefit is not as high as you think it was going to be. As a matter of fact, it's lower. And it's funny, I'm actually counting the squares, and I think I counted an extra one. So that should be a 10. I'll change that. That should be a 10. So 3 times 10, 30. So still, the point is even more dramatic. Consumers are, yes, they're benefiting from a lower cost, but they're not getting that much more out of it. And the reason for that is because the market is very inelastic. They were still going to consume the same amount, but there's more. Actually, we have a much bigger problem. The producers, the providers in this case, they're not really, let's assume this is a very low-level reaction. They're not going to change anything about that specific treatment that we're talking about, but they can do other things. They can increase the intensity of the services. They can add more services driven by technology, especially driven by technology. They can use more technology, more services, more volume. So all good things, right? Everything is good. You see what I mean? Everything is good compared to other situations. So everything is good. So in that case, they can create what we have talked about before, which is this physician-induced demand increase, where they're going to provide new services, and those new services are going to give incentives to people to overspend, because now with lower prices, they can spend more. They can get things that they were not going to get in previously, but now they're going to get them. They're going to buy them. They're going to use them. They're going to consume them. So D shifts to the right, to D prime. And at that level, P1, Q2, at that level, if you count the squares here, and hopefully I did it right this time. Okay, I had 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay, so I'm missing 2. Okay, so I'll fix that as well. So that should be 3 times 15. and that's 45, right? I'll change that as well. So okay, so consumers are now consuming more, so they have more consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus will go up to from 30. Remember, this is 30. Will go up to 45, which is not as high as it was before, 48. Now, if you think about these numbers, which I keep calling consumer surplus, is the benefit to consumers, that is also spending. And in this case, the spending is not being done by the consumers. It's actually being done, who's picking up the bill is going to be, let's say, is Medicare, Medicaid, right? So the government put this price ceiling in place, hoping to reduce cost from 48 down to 30, but it actually it only went down from 48 to 45. So it was not as significant as they thought. But there is more. This is just one part of the story. Because in this previous model, I made the assumption, crazy assumption, that providers wouldn't really react in a significant way, other than drive more of this care to see if they could get if they could provide more care for their patients and increase bills, increase the quantity and so on. But in reality, other things happen, and I have two models: in competition and under monopoly. Two different models, very different. In reality, suppliers are going to react, and they're not going to just provide the amount of care at that price ceiling that people want. No, they're going to react big time, right? And we've seen that, I think we saw in chapter 1 and 2. When you impose a price ceiling, let's say that we were at POQO, when you impose a price ceiling P1, right? Then the amount suppliers are willing to supply is going to be Q1. The amount consumers want will be Q2, right? I'm just going along the line across like this. All right? Ignore D prime for now. We're not talking about D prime yet. We're just looking at supply and demand. So the difference between these two, between Q2, so Q2 minus Q1, the difference, the big red bracket I have there, that's a shortage. That is a shortage. People want Q2, but we're only providing Q1. So there's a shortage. So what happens when there's a shortage? Well, what happens in any market? When there's a shortage, then people will react. And when people react, they will find ways to get ahead on that line, right, for care. If there are only 10 MRIs on a single day, but there are 30 people trying to get those 10 MRIs, everybody's going to try to find a way to get that MRI somehow. So yes, I know it's a little bit hard to talk about this in this class because it's healthcare, but I'm talking about a black market, which we're not talking in this class, but they do exist. In some aspects, they do exist in healthcare, but you're definitely promoting that type of thing. You have people waiting in line, wasting time, their time, they're losing wages elsewhere. They're doing all kinds of things, bribes, right? They're paying off people. They're to get ahead in the line. They're using their influence to be ahead on the line, to get that care. Perhaps, well, there are many other ways they can do it. So what happens is that people are actually paying to get that. Let's say that is an MRI. They're actually paying more than P1 to get the MRI, because the MRIs exist in such little amount that they need to do something to get to one. And I don't want to digress too much here, but I come from a system like that, so I have all this. I know all the stories of how people do it. Okay, so to get that Q1, because you want to get some of that Q1, but that's the price, right? But how much are you actually willing to pay for Q1? Well, originally we were willing to pay P2. If you take Q1 and you go up a line, right, like that, to the demand, P2, that's how much people are willing to pay for Q1. They're going to pay P1. They're going to pay P1 because that's the government. The government tells you that you cannot charge more than that. So they're going to pay P1 with money. But they're willing to pay P2. What does that mean? It means that people they will incur whatever cost is necessary up to P2 to get Q1. Meaning they will offer bribes, they will pay people off, they will wait in line, hours and hours and hours or days if needed just to get that appointment. Those are wages that they have lost. That's opportunity cost. That's what I'm talking about. That's the price that I'm talking about. Not just remember, in economics, we look at more than just monetary price. We look at other things. That's what I'm talking about. Now, so in competition, that's not going to work. You're going to create a lot of problems. However, for a monopoly, that might actually work. Because for a monopoly, there's very little they can do. They're already doing whatever the best they can do. And when you impose a price ceiling, they can't do much. But what happens with a monopoly is when you create a price ceiling of P1, and I think I need my pen for this one. Let me get, okay, I think it's activated. Okay, I think I activated it. So what happens is, as you know, for a monopoly is going to use the marginal revenue equals marginal cost as usual. So they're going to set their production where the marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, which is going to be this point right here. They're going to set that quantity, QO, and then they're going to charge the price that they find when they go up to the demand curve, PO. Okay, so that's it. That's the monopoly. Well, when the government imposes a price ceiling, what happens is effectively their marginal revenue curve becomes, I hate that, the line, the existing marginal revenue. It's not gonna let me do it, huh? I have to erase. It's gonna become that line. And then it's going to be flat across the price ceiling. Let me see if I can make this a little prettier by erasing. Okay. Not getting. Why is that? I'm not sure what is going on there. I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to try to fix this. Give me 1 second. All right. I think it looks a little bit better. Not a lot better, but a little bit better. Okay. I'll use this. It's much better. So the marginal revenue curve becomes the existing marginal curve all the way down until it hits the P1, and then it goes straight out. Okay, so the new quantity will be where the marginal revenue meets the marginal cost, and in this case it's going to be the supply curve that I have there. So it's going to be right there, P1. So as you can see, it actually worked, and they're not going to change. What could happen that is potentially bad? Well, the only thing that could happen is that, and governments need to be very careful when they do this. If you impose a price ceiling on a monopoly, it cannot be under their total average cost. If you do that, then it becomes not profitable to operate, and the monopoly will bankrupt completely. You may think that's a good thing, but maybe that is not a good thing when the only way to provide that service is by a monopoly. For example, utilities, electricity, gas, and so on. We usually need these natural monopolies to provide care, to provide the goods and services. So if you place that price ceiling too low, you will bankrupt the monopoly. So you can do it. It will have its benefits, but if you go too far, then it's bad. It's really, really, really bad. So you have to be careful.